Imagine a democracy where policy platforms and detailed white papers matter less than a candidate's ability to generate anger, pride, or fear.
It sounds pretty cynical.
It does. But Drew Westen's core claim in The Political Brain is that this emotional reality is already governing our elections. If a candidate's main job is to make you feel something rather than think something, what does that actually mean for the fate of the nation?
Well, Weston suggests the purely rational voter is a myth we just need to abandon.
It's a really provocative thesis.
It is. His explicit claim is that the political brain is an emotional brain, which forces a fundamental rethink of how political messages are delivered and, well, how they're received.
It's a crucial book.
Absolutely. But we believe that some books must be challenged. This critique uses, as appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework that maps claims to evidence. That's from Critical Thinking by Richard Paul and Linda Elder.
And we also apply an intellectual framework, drawing from the works of Mortimer Adler.
Right, and we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to identify any ethical asymmetries. Then we conclude with a logical analysis for a balanced conclusion.
And for you, the listener, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book critique. Our mission here is to hold this argument up against those high standards: rigor, fairness, ethical scrutiny, so you can walk away well-informed about its core claims and, importantly, its limits.
Okay, let's jump right in. The foundation of Weston's argument, it all starts with the brain. He builds his case by drawing heavily on neuroscience and political psychology.
And he's focusing on specific studies, right?
Yes, specifically neuroimaging work that observes what happens when highly committed partisans are faced with information that directly contradicts their worldview.
So we're talking about putting, say, a staunch conservative in an fMRI scanner and showing them evidence of a liberal policy success, or the other way around. What did those studies actually find?
Exactly that. Weston reports that when these committed voters saw disconfirming facts that really threatened their political identity, the brain regions associated with emotional processing lit up. Think self-regulation, defense mechanisms.
And what about the reasoning parts of the brain?
That's the key. The regions we usually associate with cold analytic reasoning did not show a corresponding increase in activity.
Wow, that is a powerful distinction. It sounds like the brain is it's working to protect the person's existing belief system, even if it means ignoring new facts.
We call this a form of identity protective cognition, or motivated reasoning. The brain is prioritizing its own internal consistency and that feeling of group belonging over external, factual accuracy.
So what's Wesson's big leap from that finding?
His critical extrapolation is this. Since voters' brains are wired to protect identity through this effective processing, winning politics means you have to speak to identity and emotion first. Evidence is just a supporting actor. The emotional narrative is the star.
That's a huge claim. It completely flips traditional civics class ideas on their head. So if that emotional shield is always up, what are the, say, 3 key political takeaways he pulls from this neuroscience?
They're pretty concise and quite biting. Number 1, emotions, not dispassionate reason, are the primary drivers of political judgment and voting.
Okay, that's the main thesis.
Number 2, Weston argues the center-left, particularly U.S. Democrats, habitually overestimate the power of policy details and completely underinvest in moral narratives and emotionally resonant stories.
So they bring a fact sheet to an emotional argument.
Precisely. And that leads to number 3. Effective campaigns have to accept this reality. They have to frame their facts in effective values-based language if they want any chance of getting through that emotional shield to actually move the electorate.
Now, if we hold the book up against basic standards of communication, things like clarity and relevance from the Paul Elder framework, it does really well, doesn't it?
Oh, it excels. Weston is a smooth writer. He uses an accessible, anecdote-driven style. He breaks down these complex ideas from psychology and makes them understandable.
And he backs them up with really concrete campaign moments from, 50 years of American elections? That brings a ton of clarity.
And its relevance is undeniable. He's not talking about small local races. He focuses on high-stakes presidential contests and the issues that activate our deepest moral identities. Abortion, guns, taxes, race.
The wedge issues.
Exactly. The issues where emotional framing is most powerful, which makes the book incredibly relevant.
But when we move past clarity, we have to ask about rigor and depth. Is this really a work of science, or is it something else? What kind of book are we ultimately dealing with here?
And that's where Adler's framework comes in. The book structurally is a blend of science, philosophy, history, and rhetoric. Functionally, however, Many critics would say it operates primarily as a sophisticated rhetorical handbook,
A handbook for who?
specifically for center-left candidates, showing them how to craft better messages, all wrapped in the authoritative language of neuroscience. The science gives it authority, but the content is really about strategy.
So the author is trying to answer campaign questions like, why do my guys often lose even when the polls say they should win? And how can we mobilize emotion without, just lying?
And his primary solutions are tactical: rewriting speeches, reframing attacks.
This focus, though, it raises issues of intellectual depth and breadth. What about the science itself?
Well, economists and political scientists have noted the foundational neuroscience is actually far thinner than the title might suggest. The book leans on a few key studies and then expands very quickly into political strategy. It's not a systematic review of brain science.
That's a crucial insight for anyone reading it. The title suggests a scientific treatise, but the execution feels more like a consultant's guide based on psychological insights.
And that strategic focus leads to questions about intellectual fairness, specifically confirmation by cherry-picking. Reviewers point out his historical examples are heavily tilted.
How so?
He tends to show Democrats as having the facts on their side, but just being bad at communicating, while their opponents are framed as emotionally shrewd, but often misleading or factually loose.
Which would obviously flatter the biases of his intended audience. That complicates any claim to pure scientific neutrality. He's using very specific examples to prove a point, but they don't necessarily represent the full picture.
Exactly. We have to apply the standard of breadth. What alternative explanations are missing here? He gives relatively little attention to things like institutional factors, the media ecosystem, structural polarization, or sudden economic shocks, all things that can decide an election.
Right, it's a valid critique. Focusing only on how the message is framed can minimize the impact of the reality being framed. But let's shift now from strategy to ethics. If the game is fundamentally emotional, the stakes for our democracy are massive.
They really are. Who gets to decide which emotions are constructive and which are manipulative?
We can start by applying the golden rule test. If Westen's recommended strategies, using fear, pride, moral outrage, were perfectly deployed by the candidates he opposes, would he see them as fair democratic persuasion?
The book seems to legitimize emotionally charged messaging, but only so long as the underlying policy is, in the author's view, truthful and humane.
But the second you insert a subjective judgment about which policies are truthful and humane, you create a potential double standard. That's where ethical asymmetries can creep in.
They absolutely do. Westen often condemns right-of-center emotional appeals as manipulative, but he praises left-of-center appeals when they serve causes he sees as just, like civil rights. It suggests he implies a consistent standard only to his opponents.
And this inherent tension becomes really clear when we measure it against the goals of the U.S. Preamble. Justice, domestic tranquility, general welfare, liberty. What's the long-term impact on the social fabric?
Well, mobilizing a political base emotionally cuts both ways. On one hand, it can pursue justice by making moral stakes salient, but on the other, normalizing supercharged messaging risks aggravating division and seriously undermining domestic tranquility.
So before fully endorsing or rejecting Westen's framework, that level of ethical complexity really demands a pause, a moment of reflection. We call these mindful moments, and this is why we created our YouTube channel. It offers AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
And the core question for you, the listener, becomes, how do you want to be treated as a citizen? As an emotional trigger point to be activated, or as a whole person whose feelings and reasons deserve genuine respect?
That forces attention back to the dignity of the voter, not just the efficacy of the tactic.
That perspective is crucial. We have to recognize the psychological reality that all sides use emotion. But at the same time, we have to insist that campaigns honor the citizen's capacity for critical reflection. We should use intellectual empathy to understand why people feel the way they do, even while we critique how those feelings might be exploited.
So let's synthesize all this. Where does the book succeed unequivocally? What makes it a required read?
It powerfully and I think definitively challenges the outdated myth of the purely rational voter. It aligns perfectly with decades of empirical work on motivated reasoning and effective polarization. And on a practical level, it provides vivid, tangible rewrites of speeches. It's an excellent strategic manual.
But we have to come back to its logical coherence. That seems to be the major weakness.
It is. Westen essentially critiques his opponents for manipulating emotion while urging his allies to become masters at doing the same thing, just for policies he thinks are better.
Does that internal tension invalidate his descriptive claims about the brain?
Not necessarily. The brain is emotional, his psychological points are strong. But it absolutely prevents the political brain from being accepted as a neutral philosophical guide for democratic persuasion. It's a pragmatic manual written from a specific ideological viewpoint.
So what's the most defensible reading we can take away from it? What's the ultimate lesson?
The most defensible reading of Westen isn't emotion trumps reason, but something more nuanced. The emotion is the unavoidable carrier of reason in public life. Ideas and facts can't travel in a vacuum. They have to be attached to a narrative and a moral value to be adopted.
A nuance that sometimes gets lost in his own rhetoric.
It does. But taken as a whole, the political brain is most compelling as a descriptive and strategic book about how campaigns actually work in our media-saturated democracy.
So our overall conclusion is this. The book is essential for understanding contemporary politics, but its limits appear when it's treated as a complete theory of political judgment or an ethically neutral roadmap. It's absolutely worth engaging with, but its best read alongside works on deliberative democracy to counterweight its intense campaign-centric focus. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
This critique draws on a precise framework that emphasizes mapping claims to evidence, applying disciplined intellectual standards, and foregrounding ethical analysis, helping readers transform reading into active, rational inquiry rather than passive consumption.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.